Good day, folks. It's the Monotone Man. Small disclaimer, I'll be talking from my personal experience about 3 specific MMORPGs that I've chosen. I've played a hell of a lot of MMORPGs in the past and wanted to give my opinion on the pros and cons of some of them, where they fall short and the changes in the genre. I've made it a goal to always reach and get stuck in the end game of any MMORPG I've played so far, and plan to continue doing just that. So without much further ado, please enjoy the content and feel free to weigh in on the discussion. So the first game I want to talk about, to set the scene at least, is Black Desert Online. Don't get me wrong, I played BDO for quite a while. A lot of it was on and off. The game itself looked visually fantastic. The big draw, at least for me in BDO, was not the visuals, it was the combat. When the game first released, I had an absolute blast. It was a breath of fresh air. It was 2014, everything was new and exciting, and I haven't played a grindy Korean MMO for quite a while before I touched BDO. I absolutely loved it. I was happy to be a ranger, I was happy to grind my ass off, I was happy to shotgun everywhere. The PvP over the grind spots became a thing, and it was a good thing. PvP was absolutely everywhere. I can't speak for all the other servers, but representing EU Jardine over here, we had a hell of a lot of small battles that turned into big battles quite often, guild fights. BDO felt like a dream back then. It felt like PvP was flourishing, and I loved it. The problems came later when, at least for me, Awakening was released. I was still a ranger. I hated Sword Ranger, to be fair, but Warriors got some good stuff there. But that's not the real issue. The real issue in BDO is behind the visuals. It's behind the combat, and it's behind the PvP that used to be everywhere. Outside of that, what do you have left? You've got sieges, node wars, and grinding. BDO at its very core is a shallow game, and that's just the truth. It does a good job at masking it somewhat, but at the same time it embraces it. It's unique in that way. The high quality visuals and the absurd animations mixed with excellent combat make it a really fun game when you're in the moment. But once you're out of the PvP, you only really just grind. Sure, there's more, there's horse breeding, there's life skilling, there's more stuff to do, but not everybody is interested in that. I'm not saying BDO could use a giant PvE facelift or anything, but BDO does its job well. It embraces its own system, and it does it well. The issue is, personally at least, is if I wasn't grinding out of necessity to keep up, or PvPing at the designated times, it was pretty hard to recreate those old battles that got my blood pumping at the time. And I found myself often completely AFK, which the game also somewhat promotes through AFK fishing events and a lot of other stuff that may or may not appear. I had so much time to just play other games, sometimes other MMORPGs actually, and still be somewhat relevant. Due to how much time I actually had. But before you say anything, yeah, I could have gone to Arsha, I could have created my own content, RBF, created some PvP, beat somebody up, and hope some real PvP happen. Or practice even in the arena and fight other people, create my own content in that way. But it's never been the same as it was back when everything was fresh, when the gear gap wasn't large. And it honestly, sometimes doing those repetitive things does drain the enjoyment out of the game. Some PvP fights are just severely one-sided, and it's a case of saving face or throwing shade at your opponent. Other times you're the one doing the zerging after getting tag teamed in Arsha, and you're just mad at people. It's just not the same, and unfortunately may never be the same again. Sieges and node wars remain big focus of BDO's PvP content. That's where the real fights are. That's where the tactics, the gear shines. Just like before, these fights can just be as one-sided as scenarios, zerging, outgeared. So many things can go wrong and just make it an absolute stomp. Neither side wins. It often kills guilds or gates others out of content, but that's a whole different demon. So honestly, I feel like a lot of old players may be chasing that battle high they got a long time ago, doing absurd things that turned out to be battle changing. The thing is, those things are now so rare, and anything less feels just inadequate to a lot of people. Another thing about BDO is the desync and stability. So there's a difference between Korean and other servers. Desyncing, server stability, and other problems occur quite frequently in sieges and such. People dying in iframes left and right is still a thing that happens. People teleporting on the ground, grabbing air while the person is right in front of you. And a mixture of problems that honestly seem almost impossible to fix at times. It is frustrating, but the bigger blob, the more stability issues, up to the point of lagging all the way from spawn to the gate at sieges. It just happens, and just keeling over at some unseen blast of righteous retribution. It's always extremely frustrating, but quite often, if you play the Benny Hill theme and just watch it unfold, it can be hilarious for the spectators. So we come to RNG, and God bless RNG in MMOs. Not really, but honestly RNG can be so off-putting to so many players. Before you crucify me, I'll be honest, I enjoy a good RNG system. But for some, and I put a hard emphasis on that some, it can be off-putting. Grinding, I don't know, a few 100 million, clicking an item, enhancing it, and watching all that work just disappear. This is where some players would say, well, you know, you could just buy the item, and that is the smarter thing to do. It's a very valid point, and I advise a lot of people exercise some of this themselves. I do it sometimes, but I often lack the restraint to not try to do the stupid enhance, because that high when you actually succeed, it's almost an addiction of its own. So I personally don't have a problem with the RNG system. In fact, quite often I get enjoyment from it, but quite often when you ask some players, why do you avoid X MMO? Some of them actually say they despise RNG systems like the one in BDO and many other Korean MMORPGs. I said it once and I'll say it again, we do not have a holy grail of MMORPGs that will appeal to everybody that plays the genre. And that's just how it is. There are going to be MMOs that appeal to certain people, and there is going to be unique MMOs. But in my opinion, RNG is less of a problem here and more of a does it appeal to you sort of deal. The grind is brain dead in BDO. I'll be honest, I actually enjoy a good chunk of grinding, but games like Path of Exile, other ARGs in general, do the mindless grind better. There's always something to run towards, whether it's an end boss, specific loot at the end, the drop rates, grind 20 minutes and get 5 different legendaries that may or may not be useful to your build or your end goal in general. Or you can grind 5 hours in BDO and hope that you get a Tungrad earring. I mean, that's just up to you at that point. In fact, I hear from a lot of people that I know that play Black Desert Mobile that the grind on there is actually more fun than PC, which is terrifying. The grind can be relaxing though if you're the type of person that enjoys a brain dead rotation that goes round and round, or it can be completely infuriating, but never super unrewarding. It can be unrewarding at times, but never to the degree where it's just useless. But that's BDO at its core. The game does expect you to partake in some kind of grind one way or another. It's not impossible to escape that grind and be a life skiller of a lifetime, but chances are that's all the PvE content you have, aside from zerging the crap out of world bosses as they spawn, but I don't consider that PvE content. The game at its very core is shallow, but what it does well, which is why it's currently still successful compared to a hell of a lot of other MMOs. All the problems aside, when stuff goes well in BDO, most people tend to enjoy themselves. Also, a big shout out to the balance team. Every time there's an update, something almost always becomes broken for a few months, and unless it's completely game breaking and overtuned, then it is most likely not going to be touched. If it is, however, completely game breaking and is a massive problem, then you probably have to wait a few months still, and they may get to it eventually. Accessibility for players to catch up is actually really good. Every few months or so in BDO, and especially the early periods like the 4-year anniversary, this time they're just throwing out free gear and free stuff. There's always some sort of catch-up event that allows players to catch up to the current endgame at speeds we've never seen before. I mean, I got a new friend into BDO, they played the game, they were level 40 in a couple minutes actually. It was under an hour and it was pretty fast, and they hadn't played the game before. I mean, all it takes is 20 minutes now and you're just higher level than you would have been in a couple hours back when the game released. And that's kind of a good thing for newer players to get back into the game. But a lot of them, and I'll say it's a 50-50 here, that if you spend 20 minutes swinging your phallus around in a 240 degree radius and all of a sudden you're level 40, with not much to go on, you don't really have the knowledge without searching it beforehand, you feel absolutely overpowered, you see this big ass combat system, but you're only hitting one button and it's killing everything. It kind of leads new players to feel put off, I guess. The combat system is actually quite rich and one of the bigger draws of the game. And you just smack something with a single ability and it falls over and, oh, well, yeah, there it is. For the average casual player, that would most likely be confusing, unless they looked at BDO endgame content prior to the game. This all ties into what, you know, a lot of MMORPG players actually feel at the moment, and it's more or less reinforces that it's not about the journey, it's about the destination. The leveling, first impressions, none of that really matters if you look at the endgame content, see what you like, and try to get there as fast as possible. It's just become a sprint to the end nowadays in MMOs, and I find myself doing this quite often as well. Someone will pitch an MMO to me, and I'll look at it and say, yeah, but what's the end game like? BDO has a fast track, is the point. You get to a goal much faster than when the game was released, gaining XP is easier, early mobs are weaker. That being said, honestly, with adventure log, events, leveling, speed, and so much more, if you want to play BDO, you honestly shouldn't be afraid of reaching the end game. There is a fast track with it, a bit of hard work and determination. It's quite easy to meet the bare requirements to get stuck into the juicy endgame PvP. If none of this has put you off anyway, to be fair, one of the bigger things to me that kept me playing BDO through all the flaws was the connections and friends I made. Like-minded individuals, and just playing the game together and having a good social experience. Imagine being social in MMORPGs, right? So we're going to move swiftly on to the next game in the list, which is FF14. Yoshi P's saved golden egg. So most of us already know about the FF14 origin story. If you don't, look it up. As a game though, the time I spent in FF14 is something I do not regret at all. I mean, the game itself always has its flaws, PvP being a big one of them. The PvP system was actually pretty horrible and dull to begin with. Most players do not play FF14 for the PvP as far as I know, although to Square's credit, they are working on changing the PvP and still keep it updated. So it's changed a bit, but I personally still hate it. Story was engaging to a degree. I know people that absolutely love the story and follow it as they go along, and I know those that just accept the story and move on, and then there are ones that skip it. FF14 has had such praise lately, especially during the Shadowbringers expansion. In fact, it was the only MMO to be nominated for anything, well, MMORPG, in the Game Awards of 2019. My personal experience with FF14 when I first played it, the combat system did not speak to me at all. All that slow global cooldown pushed me towards the direction of playing anything fast, anything that had skills or stacks that reduce the global cooldown and streamline the process. Eventually I branched out and tried more things. When I realized closer to the end game I got, the more skills that I had off of the global cooldown to weave into my rotation. It was nice, it was a bit intricate and fun to execute those rotations and combos. I think it got so bad to a point that I would hate any and all free companies that I would join that did not provide me with a training dummy to test my skills on, because I spent an absurd amount of time there just beating those things to death. The classes really stuck out to me were Ninja, Monk, which had some good complexity back in the day. Dragoon, Heaven's Word rotation was fun. Another big plus was being able to switch classes at the click of a button on the same character. The double-edged sword here, unfortunately, with Shadowbringers, and it happens in a lot of MMORPGs, is the further into expansions you go, the more expansions you release, the higher the level cap, the more skills, the more developers start to prune classes and sort of trim down their identities. Now, it hasn't really happened identity-wise, but some of the rotations do feel completely different to what they used to be, and I don't mean that in a good way. I mean they are weaker. Fundamentally, it just feels so much easier to pull off this new rotation with more and different skills than it was back then, and that's because of how the classes have developed over time. If we move past the story and the combat, however, which for the most part I enjoyed towards the end game, the dungeons and raids in higher difficulty of content really keep me on my toes. I love them. Everything from the small mechanic changes all the way to the goddamn music was amazing. Turning around, avoiding AoEs to get the maximum amount of DPS just felt rewarding. Avoiding these raid wipe mechanics was really fun. And then we fought primals and such. The bosses were actually cool. They felt engaging. They felt different. Bosses like Kefka from previous FF games showed up, and good God, did they really do a really good job with that music. I just can't stop praising the music. I enjoyed the music a lot. The face switches, there were face switches that, changed the entire fight. The PvE content, the progression was actually really fun. Every single expansion, it kept bringing me back to the game. And makes perfect sense how much praise Shadowbringers as an expansion has gotten lately, especially with how dry the content is right now in the MMORPG world. Good combat, well designed or interestingly designed dungeons and expansions, the ability to level all classes on one characters, crafting and fishing, hell of a lot of stuff to do in this game. PvE player's dream, to be honest. There was one big flaw for me at least, and that's mainly if you're the type of person that will happily spend the day from sunrise to sunset on your chosen MMORPG. The problem was the endgame. If I leveled everything I wanted, played the game mostly as a solo player or had a static, whatever it was, I would spend 2 hours a day, maximum, getting my pieces of gear for the week, and I was done. A good chunk of the new content was cleverly hidden behind the story, with each new section of the story revealing some new raid or dungeon or phase in the raid tier. It means I had a lot of free time, and as a person who doesn't necessarily enjoy some of the smaller things like fishing and crafting, I kind of felt empty at times. So I'd just wait for the weekly reset to progress or the sweet release of a new story so I could kill something pretty. It's almost like FF14 is one of the better PvE-based MMORPGs that also caters to a large number of people, mostly within the casual community. But that's not saying the game doesn't have hardcore elements. They just aren't as big as a deal in comparison to the general population of players that are happily enjoying all the other aspects of the game. The story, the casual side of gearing, raids, etc. I mean, don't get me wrong, if I had to recommend any MMORPG to most new players, it would be The Wonderful World of Eorzea. Although dungeon queues for DPS may be absolutely tedious at times, especially on my data center, where healers are about as rare as Ben Affleck portraying a superhero well in a movie. There is a trust system at level 71 and above where you can bypass queues and have NPCs be, tanks and stuff for you, and healers and DPS. It's a pretty good way to avoid the long queue times. There's, always a way to level in that regard and continue your story. Not to mention Heaven on High and Palace of the Dead are there for your below 50 characters and below 60 characters, 70 all the way up there. So they really did put thought into that system. There's also a fast track for new players that, will just zoom ahead in XP as soon as they start the game. And there's returning system, novice networks, and it shows the community does care and help these newer players, and the developers have given us the tools to do that. I can't give enough credit though to the majority of the FF14 community that is actually one of the friendliest communities and easiest to make friends with that I've found. And it may be due to a lack of needing the PvP all the time and create a hostile environment, so the environment is very stable. Not sure, but it's a joy to get along with people and laugh about our mistakes, but you do often get a random salty person every now and again. Also, let's not forget the big draw of the game is the fact that it's actually a Final Fantasy game, and we're talking about Square Enix here. The name is big enough to hold the game up in the rankings by itself, but at the same time there is no instance of pay to win or a paywall unless you count expansions. Square Enix doesn't really need the money, so they focus on what they have going on and have been able to do so continuously and keep the game subscription based, high population, and of a good quality for the better part of 10 years. Although the launch was an absolute monstrosity, God bless Yoshi P and his team for bringing it back as a much better game. But for someone who wants to play an MMORPG as much as I can and get the maximum I can out of it, given the time, there wasn't exactly a lot of endless opportunities that felt rewarding. So if you're interested in PvE story and actually have a life, unlike myself, I definitely suggest FF14 for sure. Totally beginner friendly, well worth the time investment, does reward group play. Also, for those interested in more hardcore content like myself, they have done some changes where at this point, even if a DPS makes a mistake, it can wipe the entire group. The new raids are actually a little more punishing for sure, especially on everybody's mistakes, and it's an interesting turn, and I'm excited to see where that goes. And you know, if you find a static or a group, you won't exactly find anything hardcore queuing for random dungeons, that's for sure, but if you get your teeth stuck into the raid content, it might be well worth the fun. So, the next game on my list is Blade and Soul. Goddamn, this game took too long coming to the West. And it brings the tear to my eye, considering the game was released in 2012. I'll be honest, I was absolutely hyped for it, especially when I saw the trailer way back in the day. It was something new, it was fresh, but it came out at a terrible, terrible timing. The market was evolving, BDO was in the works to take over the graphics and combat style. Regardless, the time I did spend in Blade and Soul was actually quite fun. It was a hell of a lot of rushing. But the gliding and running around was new. It actually felt pretty cool. The combat felt great. There was a level of complexity to certain classes and the way they played. Kung Fu Master combos come to mind. The dungeons were not terrible, but they definitely were not great, at least most of them. They had unique things, like Paharan later in the game, the whole tiger thing and the chain gun and God knows what else. But at the end of the day, it felt quite repetitive. The hidden gem of Blade and Soul was, to me at least, part of it was the soundtrack and the combat. I enjoyed it. I really connected with the... I didn't connect with the story, my bad, at all. Overall, though, the open world PvP was actually quite bad, and in most places it wasn't exciting or interesting. Blade and Soul did one thing incredibly well, though, and the one thing they did that was incredibly well, elevated the game, gave it its own esports scene, lasted quite some time in Korea, and actually brought a lot of joy to me and quite a few others in particular. It suffered from its success in this aspect. The rest of the game was somewhat mediocre, but the PvP arena, in my opinion, is where the money was. It felt good. It felt like a real fighting game mixed with an MMORPG. The classes were quite unique in their own way in this arena too. Instead of permanently slashing blade masters or mage types that would cast meteors for 3 hours, there was variety. I felt challenged and I felt somewhat fulfilled. And it felt really good when I was actually able to pull combos off correctly, learn matchups, and beat people I should theoretically have no business beating. It made it competitive for sure, and in a lot of ways frustrating as any other game that requires the conditions of winning or losing. The game literally became its PvP arena, for me at least, very early on. After tasting most of the game and getting really bored of the dailies at the end game, getting stuck into the PvP, I just didn't want to leave. I wanted to improve and constantly grow in that environment. The high APM, getting someone stuck in a spider web and getting off the perfect amount of damage right before moving into a second part of the combo. The small but significant variety between matchups. I remember using certain bombs on an assassin and skilled adjustments where certain classes, and god damn I loved practicing it. And it was a nurturing environment sometimes if I would practice against my friends and learn those combos. But what we learned from this is content creators got involved and promoted the game. You know, I mean, there was already a Korean esports scene by the time it was released in EU and NA. But when it came to the West, people actually showed up on streaming websites like Twitch to watch people play. I think it was mostly the NA scene, but it was a breath of fresh air to see players run competitive PvP tournaments of their own, you know, volition. Evolving month after month, getting much more professional, getting much more, you know, exposure. It was fun. And it was definitely good for the game itself, both in terms of promotion and longevity, in fact. Quite a few Blade and Soul streamers picked up a following that they then took to other games. The PvP was never enough to carry the rest of the game for me though, at least. After a while, I got bored. When more pay-to-win options were introduced, when lag hit, how certain players couldn't do anything with good ping, the botters, the open world being absolute trash, the daily quest grind, the economy, the bugs, the lack of diversity and relevant content. It was for sure fun while it lasted, and most of it is due to the PvP system. As much as I'd love to dissect more of the game, it honestly was just PvP for me at that point, and that's all that managed to hold my attention for more than a couple months, and that's where my efforts were focused. I gave the game a try, and when it became more apparent that all I could enjoy was beating people to death over and over again, I moved on. I didn't want to just live in a fighting game, I wanted a full-on MMORPG experience. It did feel like Blade and Soul was a play this while you wait for a new X-MMO sort of deal, more than once though, and it's unfortunate, but that's what it was. So, out of those three games, in conclusion, there is something I will say about MMORPGs though. Those of you that are not new to the genre will know that I missed a very specific giant of MMORPGs, but I also missed out quite a lot of other noteworthy MMORPGs. Since, well, we don't want a 7-hour video here, and I'm not sure how well this video itself will be received. The giant I'm talking about is known as World of Warcraft. Legion was fun, by the way. BFA, absolute abomination. However, I kept WoW off the list because of a combination of how much there is to tackle while talking about WoW, and also to make a point that so many MMORPGs, investors, designers, and such always look to WoW as a way to be successful. If we take a look at Final Fantasy XIV, when it first released, it was not the way it is right now. It wasn't even close. It was a failed game that took time and huge investment to make into a completely different and highly successful version of itself. And the big thing they did was actually make the game more like WoW. It became more of a theme park. Granted, things have changed. I prefer FF14's PvE content to WoW at this point, but the point remains the same. When someone asked me to describe FF14 in a few words, the first phrase that popped into my head was, it's what World of Warcraft would have been if it was made by Square Enix. Don't get me wrong, WoW has done a lot of things. The lore was rich. The game pretty much put MMORPGs on a radar for so many different people that didn't even know the genre existed, and has continued to either make good or bad decisions with each expansion that for some reason other MMORPGs try to copy and fall flat on their faces. I could complain about this for quite some time, but I will move on to my next point. The community. When an MMORPG is released, there's a vocal number of people that try to steer the game in one direction or another. We see this so many times in so many different games, it's not even funny at this point. Arcade Unchained, for example. Players complained about pay to win, New World, new changes, players complained about the PvP, and so many more. But these are the two examples off the top of my head. People will always complain, and if they make enough of a noise, it will affect the game. The developers will feel pressured, and something may change, which could mean in the future our legitimate concerns get ignored because we're busy arguing over trivial stuff. But that's not the only place where the community happens to fall short. We are probably one of the more toxic communities in the gaming world with how much we put down each other for playing whatever MMORPG we enjoy. What we honestly need to understand is that as a community, it's actually fine if somebody enjoys the sandbox while you enjoy a theme park, and someone else is just a beginner that's looking for some PvP experience, or somebody else that's involved in a grindcore game. So many of us want things handed to us, or to get to the end game as soon as possible with many cheap and quick fixes, that no one ever focuses on the journey or the social aspect anymore. How many of us actually look at an MMORPG and enjoy it for what it is throughout the game? I know a large chunk of the community whose first question is, yeah, but what's the end game like? It's so much less about the adventure and the journey nowadays, and so much more about how fast can I get the shiny piece at the end for bragging rights. There are complete scam games in the genre though, that literally focus on milking as much money out of the player base. whether it's through addiction techniques and collectibles or just banking on that dry MMORPG season that keeps coming up. I mean, bloody Bless Online decided they wanted to fail in every region, on every platform, shamelessly, and so many of us still bought into that game. Some of us are still hell-bent on reliving the old MMORPG experiences we had and look to every new MMORPG as the new hotness. And it will take us back to the nostalgia days. I know I'm the same. I can honestly admit that. I often overlook red flags just so I can sink my teeth into a new game, get some new content, get a new MMORPG fix, like an addict. Another point to this is how MMORPG designers seem to prefer making games rather than maintaining them. The company behind Black Desert Online, for example, Pearl Abyss, is actually working on not one, but 3 MMOs. Plan 8, Doka V, and Crimson Desert. Not to mention, they've released BDO Mobile recently, and the new Shadow Arena standalone Battle Royale isn't far, considering BDO still exists and is still making money, yet it is still having problems that have not been fixed. 3 new MMOs and another 2 games? That baffles me. Either they must have huge teams, or they're really just focused on maintaining what they have in BDO while releasing new things elsewhere for the big payday. It's not all on the community either. Investors, designers, developers, all of those do not want to risk their asses trying something new and innovative. Word of advice to designers and developers is that it's okay to implement new and exciting things. You don't have to attract the entire MMORPG community for your game to work. It doesn't need to be a WoW clone. You don't need elements from all types of MMOs. If you want PvE, focus on that. Focus on PvP. Be like BDO, but better. Be shallow to a degree, but do those shallow things well. Open world, for example. Make it a living, breathing world. Do something the community will be happy about. We need new blood in the MMORPG world, and part of me is still holding out hope for New World and the new Lord of the Rings MMORPG that should be arriving somewhere in the future. Back to the example of BDO again, is they did the shallow thing, and they did the shallow thing well. They kept it that way. You don't need to appeal to absolutely everybody, steal elements from every part of the genre, and hope that your game works. You can make it work. I've enjoyed many of the games I've talked about, and many others that I've left off of the list due to lack of popularity at the moment, or in general to keep the video, at a respectable time. If there's enough interest, I could elaborate on experiences and thoughts on other games while keeping the discussion active. It's been my dream to create content for the MMORPG world and bring up thought-provoking discussions for the things that I love, which just happen to be MMORPGs and games in general. Again, these are just my opinions, and I'd love to have a discussion and talk about these things, talk about the video, talk about anything that I've done. Any advice is welcome. Any likes, subscribes, shares are highly appreciated. And I'll be streaming on Twitch if you want a lively chat or just want to hop in with some random game action. There'll be a link in the description below. All I can personally hope for is a brighter future for MMORPGs and our respective communities in this time of great need. This has been my first video. It's gonna be a bumpy ride. Hopefully it's somewhat presentable. I hope I've been somewhat informative, and I thank you for joining me. Peace.